Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the EPR packaging update from Ecovertias. You've been muted and your camera has been turned off just to keep feedback to a minimum. We really appreciate you joining us today. It's really valuable to do these kind of webinars to transfer that knowledge, so we appreciate you joining us. The recording is the webinar is being recorded, so it will be placed on our YouTube channel and pushed down social media posts. So if anybody needs to get hold of the recording, it will be on our YouTube channel. You will also be sent a feedback form post webinar. We really appreciate if you'd fill that in, because that gives us a good indication of what value you've got out of these webinars, and also gives you the opportunity to suggest future topics. So I hope you enjoy. If you do have any questions for the presenters, please pop them in the chat function, or if you're brave enough at the end of the webinar to turn on your camera, please give us a wave, and one of the presenters, Sandy or Lily, will endeavour to help you with those questions. So I'm going to hand over to the ladies, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Jodie. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. So my name's Sandy. I'm the commercial manager at Ecovertias, and I'm joined by my colleague Lily, who's our customer success manager, and we will be your hosts for the webinar. So lovely to meet you all, and hopefully you find this webinar useful on EPR. So I think Jodie pretty much covered the housekeeping slides. So yeah, please do, Lily, while I'm speaking, Lily will monitor the chat box. And while Lily's speaking, I'll manage the chat box. So please feel free to pop your questions in there and we will answer them as we go along. And then once we get to the end of the webinar, we'll run through them. And if anyone's got any further questions, we can obviously go through them at the end of the webinar. So I think, yeah, and as Jodie said, we'll circulate the slides and the recording, so you have that to go through at a later date. So I'm going to quickly take you through the agenda, because we've got quite a lot to go through and we've got an hour essentially to cover everything. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to do a brief overview of EPR, because I'm sure there's a mixture of people on the call today. Some of you might be new to EPR, and some of you might have had the pleasure of doing submissions under EPR. So we just wanted to do a brief overview and give you some updates of where we're at with the legislation. We've allocated a little bit of time to cover the recyclability assessment methodology, which is referred to as RAM under EPR. It was a new reporting requirement that came into place last year, which focuses on declaring data around the recyclability of your packaging. And this does impact your costs. So we just want to spend a little bit of time explaining RAM and how it impacts businesses under EPR. And then what we'll do is we'll focus a little bit about how the brewing industry is specifically affected by EPR and some of the challenges that we're seeing businesses facing at the moment, and just focus on how you can spend time perhaps reducing some of those risks under EPR, or planning for the future as changes roll in. And we'll sort of give you some insight on how we're supporting businesses under EPR as well. And then we'll finish with a Q&A session. So hopefully it goes all smooth, and we have, 10 minutes at the end to sort of go through everyone's questions. So for those of you who don't know us, we're Ecovertias. We're an environmental consultancy who support businesses with collecting data for EPR and doing the reporting and calculations. We've been around since the beginning of the regulations, the packaging waste regulations in the UK. So we're over 25 years old, and we support many businesses in various sectors, and we do work with a number of pubs, brewers, that to help them fulfill their obligations under EPR. So that's just a little bit about us and what we do. So why are we here? We're here because the UK has decided to implement a big change. We had packaging waste regulations for over 25 years, but about 2 years ago, the system was revised and we've moved to what is referred to an extended producer responsibility system. And the reason for this change was the system we had before was great, but it had been running for a long time, which meant that really recycling rates under the old legislation had plateaued. Household curbside recycling had become inconsistent, and really it wasn't that clear for consumers what could and couldn't be recycled. So I think industry and the government recognised that the regulations needed to be reviewed, and we needed to change those and update those, and perhaps follow what was already happening across Europe and wider than that, who had already implemented extended producer responsibility. So yeah, we've been through a big change over the last 2 years, and those are some of the reasons why EPR has been implemented. So really, what EPR is there to do is to make producers responsible for the end of life of products and packaging once they enter the waste stream in the UK. So what it's doing is basically pushing the full cost of reprocessing, recycling packaging that goes onto the UK market. And really the framework is then there to incentivize businesses to think about the packaging that they're putting onto the market. So to think about, okay, is that packaging going to be recyclable? And really what pushes businesses to do that is the cost linked to EPR. And we'll look at the costs and how that can impact businesses a bit later on in the presentation. But really that's sort of the principle of EPR. And that's the reason it's been introduced. I'm now going to pass you over to Lily, who's going to give you a bit more of an overview of EPR and some of the changes.
Yes, hello. So this slide is kind of putting at the forefront I suppose the biggest thing for EPR and producers specifically is that there are fees associated with the packaging that you're putting onto the market. So when we're thinking about those fees, I think it's quite good to understand where they're kind of going to, what they're kind of being collected for. So you have collecting and sorting and disposing of that household packaging, which are being covered by the EPR fees specifically. And then you can see reprocessing is in orange on the slide. This is specifically covered by PRNs. So you have two kind of fee systems in place under EPR now. And PRNs had been under the old regulations and have kind of remained with the introduction of EPR. So when we're thinking about the fees that are being collected from producers and distributed to local authorities, these are the kind of activities that those fees are going to support and cover. There's obviously a big increase in the fees that are collected to kind of cover these activities and take that burden away from the local authorities and the taxpayer. So the government estimate for the first year was recovering 1.5 billion to cover those household fee costs, essentially. If we go to the next slide. So when we're talking about the fees that you pay and the two kind of streams that there are, there's also two waste streams to kind of be aware of. So there's household, which if you're obligated on that packaging, you pay a PRN and an EPR fee on. And then there's non-household packaging. So that is subject to PRN fees only. So just needing that reprocessing part to be covered. So typically, by default, essentially, household packaging is classified as your primary packaging and your shipment packaging. So primary, that's anything that's containing the product. and really anything that then is going home with the consumer to do with that product and that packaging. And then shipment as well, that's things like e-commerce, where that's being delivered to the doorstep, and then obviously going into that household waste stream. Non-household then is more business kind of waste that you as the business would be removing from the packaging. It's things like secondary packaging, so the packaging that is used to kind of contain the primary elements, and then tertiary packaging as well, so that's things like pallets, pallet wrap. So they're really what is being removed by businesses and not going to that end consumer. Although there are nuances here, so primary and shipment packaging can be classed as non-household if it meets the two tests that are on the screen. So packaging supplied to a business or a public institution, so it might be primary, but it's never actually going to go into a household waste bin, or it's specifically kind of designed for a business use. So there are instances where primary and shipment won't be going into household, but they do need to meet those two kind of criteria to kind of say that, basically. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. So if we're then looking at reporting, so we've got two waste streams, two fee structures. There's then two kind of reporting elements for EPR. So you've got waste cost and recycling. So this is the obligated packaging that you're putting onto the market. It's what you're paying your EPR fees on, and it's what you're paying your PRNs on. But there's also a reporting requirement under EPR to say where packaging is being disposed of by the devolved nations in the UK. So really, saying where your packaging has gone between England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. This report has no fees associated, so it's different in that kind of respect to the waste cost and recycling element of it, which has the EPR and the PRN fees. Nation of sale is more of a reporting requirement with no fees attached. So when we're looking at how you're obligated and who might be obligated under the EPR system for waste cost and recycling, there's kind of three thresholds, I suppose. So you've got a large producer who you have a turnover of over £2 million and you handle more than 50 tonnes of packaging. Meeting both of those criteria would make you a large producer. You've then got a small producer who, if you're handling between 25 and 50 tonnes of packaging a year, and your turnover is between 1 and 2 million, that would put you as a small producer. And then if you're doing under the 25 tonne kind of threshold, or you've got a smaller turnover than under 1 million, then you would not be obligated. So there's three levels of obligation, basically, which I think we'll outline in the upcoming slides. But when you're thinking about obligation, it's meeting the two criteria of tonnage and turnover to make you both either large producer, small producer. So then nation of sale has an obligation threshold as well. So you're obligated, this is more on a selling obligation, and it's whether the packaging that you're handling is over 25 tonnes and your turnover is over 1 million. But it's really about that, the selling kind of element there that would mean you need to undertake this report, basically. So under the old regulations, there was a different kind of distribution of obligations depending on your activity and your part in the chain of the packaging's life cycle. But under EPR, it's really about putting one point of responsibility on one producer. So when we're thinking about what makes you obligated, it's looking at the activities that are listed on the screen there. So whether you're a brand owner or whether you're importing packaging into the UK. If you're a packer filler, so this is where you're buying empty packaging and putting product into that packaging. And then distributor, supplied as empty, service provider, or an online marketplace. We'll go into more detail about these on another slide, but really when we're thinking about what you're obligated on, it's if you're performing those activities, that's where you would pick up an obligation, essentially. So we've got a bit more of a detail around those activities here. So brand owner is really anything that is supplied on the market and has your name, your trademark, or a distinguishing mark to the business. And that's kind of, there is no, with EPR, it's not quite a straightforward decision tree to establish, packaging's obligation, but brand owner kind of takes the trump of that packaging obligation. So if there's a brand owner, that's kind of a key thing to establish on the packaging, to understand if you're obligated or if it's someone else's obligation. It's a really key part to know. So if you're a brand owner, you'd be obligated on that packaging. Then if you're a packer filler, like I said, it's buying empty packaging and putting product into it. So that's where there's no brand owner that takes the obligation. So it's empty, it's unbranded, you're filling it, it would make you obligated. And then importing, if you're the one who's directly importing the filled packaging into the UK, you would pick up the obligation. Service provider, if you're hiring or lending reusable packaging, and we might see this, we've put the little beer bottles on the ones that we think are kind of most relevant to the brewing, food and beverage sector. And so you can kind of think about where your obligations might be in these kind of roles. And then we have distributor as well. So whether you're manufacturing or importing empty packaging and supply it on where the large producer doesn't ultimately use it, essentially. So online marketplace is at the bottom there, and this can be a bit of a red herring because it can sound like if you're doing e-commerce, then that's a kind of obligated role, but really it's more of a where there's a platform that facilitates internet-based sales. So it's not necessarily e-commerce on its own. It's really if you have a platform where other people are selling to each other. It's basically that. So when we're looking at the types of producers there are, so I outlined that there's a large producer, small producer, and then de minimis, and then seller if you're obligated for the nation of sale. There are different requirements that come with each obligation kind of type. So for a large producer, you would be reporting biannually. So from January, for the period of January to June of a calendar year, and then July to December of that calendar year. So you would report those two periods into kind of reporting kind of time frames, and then you would also be liable to pay the EA fee, which is just the membership, not membership, the kind of registering with the EA that you're going to submit this data. You'd pay your PRN fees, which would be on your household, non-household, and you'd pay your EPR fees as well. You also might have compliance scheme fees in there and things like that. So really being a large producer, the reporting kind of requirement is more, and there are more fees associated with what you're actually reporting. For a small producer, it's a little bit different. So you would report one calendar year period, and you would just pay your EA registration fee. You also might have compliance scheme fees in there too, but you wouldn't pay any PRNs or EPR fees on the packaging. It would just be to report what you're kind of obligated on. Nation of sale is also an annual report, so you're doing it for the calendar year, and there are, like I said in the beginning, no fees associated with your nation of sale report. And then if you're under all the thresholds, there are no requirements for you. So this slide kind of demonstrates how the journey for you as the producer when you're reporting the packaging is working, and then the journey that the people that you're reporting to and the regulator and the local authorities is kind of in the top band. So if we think about what a producer does, you are enrolling to say that you're going to report your data, and you would do that on the RPD portal. It stands for Report Packaging Data Portal. You'd then be collecting your data, submitting it to your compliance scheme or directly to the EA. You then have your PRNs procured, meaning that your obligation could be met, and then paying your EPR fees and looking at what self-managed waste you have as well as a business. So if we think about the compliance scheme role in that kind of journey, once you've submitted that data, if you have a compliance scheme, they'll be reviewing it and submitting it to the EA, and they'll be the ones purchasing your PRNs and kind of taking care of that element of procurement of PRNs for you. And then if we think about who they're submitting to, so the regulator, so PAC UK, who are kind of the scheme administrator in this, who are responsible for looking at how the fees need to be distributed and things. So they're planning the fee part of it, and also, calculating and collecting the fees from you, and then they're handling the payments to the local authorities. So then your local authorities are they're looking at the household waste that you're producing and collecting that, and there's then the reprocessing element that happens at the end as well. So it's kind of a journey of reporting that kind of starts with producers, but there's other bodies that are involved, like compliance schemes like PAC UK, who then handle it. All kind of works in this cycle to handle the packaging and make sure that it's all accounted for, paid for, and then appropriately disposed of as well. I'll hand over to Sandy, who's going to take you through a bit about the RAM methodology.
Thanks, Lily. So we just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into RAM, purely because as EPR has evolved, RAM was introduced last year, so it's a fairly new reporting requirement under EPR, and quite onerous, to be honest, for a lot of businesses to gather the information. So we just wanted to touch on it. It is a bigger topic than this. You could actually spend a separate session on it. So we've just got a couple of slides, but we can obviously share more information on RAM if required following the webinar. So what is RAM? So RAM is only going to affect you if you are classed as a large producer under EPR. So obviously Lily outlined in the previous slides, there is a distinction between if you're large or small under EPR. So if you're small, you don't need to worry about RAM. But if you are classified as a larger producer, you will need to assess the recyclability of any packaging that you are declaring that ends up in the household waste stream. This is something you need to think about as a large producer. And what RAM does is it makes you essentially grade your packaging into a traffic light system. So categorizing it or rating it as either red, amber or green. And you have to answer a series of questions to get to that rating. So typically speaking, red packaging will end up being packaging that can't be recycled within the UK infrastructure. It's problematic. It has a lot of material disruptors in it. So that's what would be categorized as red. Amber packaging would typically be, it can be recycled, but it needs a specialist infrastructure to be recycled, or once it is recycled or reprocessed, the quality of that packaging reduces. And then green packaging will be packaging that's widely recyclable. So, like I said, there are a series of questions that you have to answer for each packaging component that you answer to end up with the rating. You simply can't just state, I think my packaging is green, or I think it's amber. You have to sort of prove that the packaging can be recycled at curbside. It doesn't have certain material disruptors in it. You have to look at the colouring of your packaging and follow those questions through to get your RAM rating at the end of it. So why is it important? The reason RAM is important is, depending upon how your packaging is rated, we are moving to fee modulation, and I'll show you the costs on the next slide. So if your packaging is categorized as green, you are going to pay lower fees. If your packaging is categorized as red, you're going to end up paying higher fees. So if you don't do this assessment, automatically your packaging will end up in red and you'll pay higher fees. So it is important to look at the recyclability of your packaging and categorize it correctly. And now it is mandatory. If you're a large producer, it is mandatory to do the RAM assessment as part of your EPR submission. So how the RAM costs are going to work. So this year will be the first set of invoices that producers will receive under RAM for the packaging that they put on the market between January and December 2025. So what the government have implemented is, in the first year of RAM, there will be a surcharge on any packaging that is classified as red, and that surcharge will be 20% on top of your EPR base fees. And then by year 3, that will go up to 60%, and by year 4, it will be 100%. So you will essentially pay double if any of your packaging is still in red. So they're essentially trying to incentivize businesses to really think about if they're putting any packaging that's not recyclable. And if they don't change that, then by the time we get to 2028, your bill will automatically double if you've got household packaging that can't be recycled. So you can see in sort of the Excel chart what the current fees are and what they're predicting for this year in terms of if your packaging is in green per ton, if it's in amber, or if it's in red. So you can see that your bill can significantly increase if you have got packaging that is in amber or red. So it's really, really important, I think, to really understand what packaging you're putting onto the market, and then also the recyclability around that. With EPR and RAM, since the beginning of the rollout of EPR, it hasn't been the best rollout, so there has been delays. So if you've reported under EPR and you were doing RAM for the first time, the government did allow businesses to a little bit of time to adjust to this new reporting requirement. So last year, when they had to report half year 1, the government did say that if you don't have RAM data at this stage, they gave businesses a little longer so that they could then work on that and submit their RAM data when it came to half year 2. So the submission that's just been done in April of this year. However, that sort of period of grace was only given for that period of time. Going forward, any reports that you do under EPR, RAM is mandatory. So you must submit RAM data. If you don't, and you can't prove the recyclability of your packaging, everything will default to red. So you will automatically pay the higher fees under the system. So this is a quick snapshot of RAM. We did run a separate webinar on RAM. So we do have a whole session on this. So if you do need more information on RAM, please do get in touch with us. We can share that webinar with you, and we can obviously share more information. It is quite a complex reporting requirement. And like I said, you can easily spend a couple of hours on this, but we just wanted to highlight it in this webinar so that businesses are aware that this is required under EPR and how it will impact costs going forwards. Okay, so we wanted to touch upon, obviously Lily's mentioned looking at how you define yourself as a producer under EPR, but there are lots of other reporting requirements.
Are you going to cross it?
That you need to take into consideration.
Today. I'm wondering whether to run with RBD today.
Oh, sorry. I think there's some noise coming in. If you are not on mute, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. Thank you. So there are lots of different data points that you need to collect under EPR to then pull your submission together. So as Lily highlighted, it's really important to understand what producer type you are. So all of the packaging that is passing through your business, you need to understand, am I the brand owner for that packaging that's passing through my business? Am I actually the packer filler because I'm putting product into unbranded packaging? Is there any packaging that I'm directly importing that I'm responsible for? Or am I leasing out packaging to anybody? So that's a great place to start, to just understand, what producer you are under EPR. But then on top of that, you need to collect data around your packaging to be able to do the EPR reporting. And the way that you need to report data is it's split by packaging layer. So you need to understand the primary packaging around your product. You need to understand if there's any secondary packaging that you're adding, and then any shipment packaging. So if you are doing e-commerce, is there any mail order packaging that you are adding to your product? And then any tertiary or transit packaging. Then you also need to break your data out by the different material types, because the levies are different for the different materials that you handle. So, for example, if it is, a beer bottle that you're the brand owner of, and you've got the glass bottle, you might have a metal cap, you might have a paper label. You need to understand the different materials that make up that primary unit and be able to split those components out across those materials, and have weights for each component as well. So what does the bottle weigh? What does the label weigh? What does the cap weigh? If there's then 12 bottles going into a cardboard box, what does that cardboard box weigh? And then if it's 50 boxes going onto a pallet that's stretch wrap, what does the pallet weigh? What does the stretch wrap weigh? And what are the material types for each of those components? Then, as Lily highlighted, under EPR, it's important to distinguish whether that packaging is going to end up in the household waste stream or the non-household waste stream. So you do need to flag your packaging into those categories, because if it's ending up in the household waste stream, you're going to have to pay EPR fees on top of your PRN costs. Whereas if it's ending up in the non-household waste stream, you'll only have to pay PRNs. So it is really important to understand where your packaging is going to end up once it's sold and it leaves your business, because that will impact your costs. There is separate reporting requirements for packaging that will end up in the public bins. And so that's like on-the-go packaging. So if you're handling on-the-go packaging, there are separate reporting sections that you need to report that packaging in. And then obviously your sector will be handling drinks. So drinks specifically also have a separate reporting section on the form. So you have to sort of pull that data out and report it on the form separately. And then if you're using any reusable packaging that is going to be reused, but it's new for the first time, that needs to be flagged in the data as well. So there's loads of things you need to know about your packaging, because you'll need to report it separately on the form. So it's really understanding which elements impact you and making sure that you flag that in the data so you can pull it out. Under EPR, you also have to report on what is referred to as self-managed waste. So there's two types of self-managed waste, and one is self-managed consumer waste. So this is for packaging that you as a business might have set up a separate take-back scheme, because that packaging can't be recycled at curbside. So a typical example of this is flexible plastics. So a lot of supermarkets have set up take-back systems where you can take your carrier bags or bread bags or flexible packaging back to the store. The store will collect it, and then they will reprocess that separately, because we can't at the moment recycle that at curbside. Flexible plastics is being looked at, but at the moment your local authority won't collect that and recycle it. So if that is happening and you've set up a separate take back for that packaging, there's a separate section on the form that you can declare the tonnages for that, and that tonnage will then be offset against your EPR fees, because obviously you're collecting it, you're reprocessing it, it's not collected by the local authority, so you don't need to pay EPR fees on it, but you do have to have certain evidence to prove that is happening. Then self-managed organisational waste, there's a separate section just to report your backdoor waste, so packaging that's being backhauled from your sites. Self-managed organisational waste doesn't carry a fee. It doesn't reduce your obligation, but it's a reporting requirement because the government want to understand waste that's being collected by businesses, and what they're doing with that. So again, that's another element of data that you'll need to collect to report on under EPR. And then obviously we've touched upon RAM. So RAM and recyclability of your household packaging also needs to be reported under EPR. So you can see there's obviously a lot of data points that you need to collect under EPR to then complete your report and your submissions either onto RPD or to your compliance scheme. So this just summarises it for you. So it's just making sure, have you got this data? If you haven't, where are you going to get it from? Who do you need to speak to internally to help with this? Because sometimes a lot of this data can be spread across the business. So you might need to speak to purchasing, you might need to speak to finance or procurement to help you gather all of this information to be able to pull your submission together. And then just a couple of notes that obviously if you're a small producer, you don't obviously need information on household, non-household, because you're not going to be paying EPR fees. So for small producers, the reporting element is slightly stripped back in terms of the data you need to collect. Okay, I won't spend too long on this, but sometimes we get asked quite a lot in terms of, okay, what's the definition of primary, secondary, shipment and tertiary packaging? What do I classify in those layers? So this is just a summary to just, guide you in terms of, okay, what is classed as primary, and usually is, the consumer unit that the customer takes home. And typically secondary is the outer box. And then as Lily highlighted, shipment is specific to e-commerce packaging. So that definition is quite specific in terms of what is classed as shipment. And then tertiary is usually things like your pallets, your stretch wrap, your corner protectors, things like that, that you use to protect your goods in transit. So hopefully that sort of helps with understanding what the different packaging layers are and how you would distinguish your packaging that you're supplying to your customers. Okay, so this slide we just wanted to include because this is probably relevant to your sector in terms of, you know, some of the businesses on the call or in the industry. You know, you might be a contract packer, or you're using contract packers or third-party warehouses to handle your goods. So there's a few sort of nuances and understanding who owns the packaging, you know, if you're using a contract packer or you are a contract packer. So for large producers, if you are a contract packer and you are packing for someone else, and it's their brand on that packaging, it will always be the brand owner that takes responsibility for that packaging, regardless of who is packaging that product. So that, I think that's important to know. So if you're a third party contract packer and you're packing for another brand, it will be the brand owner that needs to declare it on their EPR submission. And obviously if you're the brand owner and you're using someone else to pack your product, you need to make sure that you've got access to that data and the packaging that they're filling into, because it will be your responsibility to declare that. Any unbranded packaging that a contract packer is adding, so things like pallets, stretch wrap, or any plain boxes, etc., it will be whoever owns the unbranded packaging at the point of filling it. So if you're a contract packer and you're bringing in cardboard boxes to fill on behalf of your customer, if they're unbranded, you're buying them, you're going to be responsible because you own them at the time of that filling activity. Where you might not be responsible is if your customer has supplied you with those boxes. So it's all about ownership when it comes to unbranded packaging. And then for small producers, it gets a little bit more complicated. So again, if you're the contract packer who owns the packaging at the time of filling, and you're supplying it to a small producer, it will be the contract packer who reports it as a packer filler. If you're a small producer who owns the packaging, obviously you're not going to declare that on your form because you're a small producer and you're not going to be picking up the cost. So it will be the distributor that supplied it to you that will have to put that on their form, because they are supplying empty packaging to a producer that is not large. So it starts to get a little bit complicated if you are a manufacturer of empty packaging or you're supplying empty packaging. If that does impact you, then it's worth having a conversation with us or your compliance scheme, just to make sure that you're picking up the right responsibility in that scenario. Okay, so we just wanted to highlight the deadlines and what the reporting deadlines are if you are a producer under EPR. So Lily touched on these a bit earlier. So if you're a large producer, you have to report biannually. So it's every 6 months, and the deadline is 1st of October and the 1st of April. So when you're collecting data and you're collecting data for the first half of the year, January to June, and you then report in October. And then you then have to collect data from July to December and then report that in the following April. So it is, you know, a higher frequency for large producers. It can feel like you come out of one submission and then you've got to then do the next one. And then for small producers, you just have to report once a year on all-year data, and that deadline is April each year for the previous year packaging handled. What is worth noting is those deadlines, so the 1st of October and the 1st of April, are government deadlines. So they're the absolute cut-off points where data needs to be submitted. Now, if you're submitting data through a compliance scheme, their deadlines will be earlier than that. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Usually, if you're going through a compliance scheme, you have to be submitting data to them 4 or 6 weeks earlier, because they need time to validate your data, check it, review it, and then they will then submit your data before those deadlines. So something to be aware of. So, you won't, the likelihood is you won't have until the beginning of October to submit this. You'll probably need to submit your data around September time. So you have to start way earlier than these deadlines. Nation of sale reports. So Lily mentioned that obviously there is a separate nation of sale reporting requirement under EPR. Now, at the moment, what businesses have been required to do is collect nation of sale data and then keep that on file. Official reporting has been delayed for the last 2 years, and it will start from next year. So nation of sale reporting, it will be a mandatory requirement to report that data to the Environment Agency by the 1st of April 2027. So I think businesses that are already reporting under EPR have already started to collect this data. If you haven't, now's the time to make sure that you're collecting that data and you're ready to report it in April next year. Fees under EPR. So there are Environment Agency registration fees, and we've just listed those there, so you can see what it costs to register. And obviously you will have additional fees on top of that, such as your compliance scheme membership fees and the EPR and PRN fees. But these are just the registration fees to show you what the EA charge. Just to report your data, everybody has to pay these registration fees. If you're late or you need to resubmit your data after the reporting deadlines, there are fees applicable there as well. So you can still register late, but you will be penalised for registering late. And if you then submit data and you need to change that, you will have to pay a resubmission fee to change your data. So these are all things to bear in mind. So that's what's sometimes quite important. If you can get your data right the first time and on time, it will reduce the fee impact on you as a business. Okay, and then just to summarise how fees are sort of, how do you get your invoices? Because last year was the first time businesses received invoices under EPR, and I think for a lot of businesses it was a bit of a shock. It's a new system, and it's just good to know how the process, what the process is. So for small producers, typically what happens is when you submit your data on RPD, if you're submitting directly, you will pay the agency registration fees when you submit the data. Or if you're going via a compliance scheme, you'll submit your data to your compliance scheme. They will bill you for the registration fee and their membership and the membership fee. So you sort of pay through that avenue. If you're a large producer, you're going to have costs that you pay through the compliance scheme, but you're also then going to get a separate invoice from PAC UK for your EPR fees. So it's a bit of a pain. So you kind of have receiving 2 invoices rather than one. So your compliance scheme will bill you for your EA registration fee, their membership fee, and the PRN fees. That's what they take responsibility for. And then separately, you will receive an invoice from PAC UK on your RPD portal, through your RPD portal, which will be specific to your EPR fees that you're paying on household. One thing to note is you will have to access your EPR fee invoice, which is referred to as a notice of liability, through the RPD portal. So you will have to log in and access your invoice that way. There was a bit of fraud in the system last year where invoices were being directly sent via email. Now PAC UK have confirmed you will never receive an invoice via email from them or anyone else. You do have to log into your RPD portal to access your invoices. So if you do receive a suspicious email or an invoice from PAC UK via email, don't pay it. always log into your account to access the invoice and pay it that way. There was also some headlines last year around there being a shortfall. So because because customers were going to, well, not customers, because producers were going to pay EPR bills for the first time last year, there was a lot of businesses resubmitting data. So obviously once businesses started to realise that their bill was going to be quite significant, they were re-evaluating the data they were submitting to make sure it was accurate. And there were a lot of resubmissions, which then meant that the costs and the fees that were anticipated by PAC UK, because there was a reduction with loads of businesses resubmitting, there was a shortfall in the overall money that the government were expecting to pay to local authorities. So that shortfall, what the government decided to do was cover that shortfall as a one-off rather than push those costs back to businesses. But what they have stipulated is that going forwards, to prevent that happening again, there will be a cut-off point as to when you can resubmit. So you will not, once you submit in April, I think it's up until September you'll be able to resubmit data. After that point, you won't be allowed to resubmit data if it's going to go down, because they can't have this situation happening again. So they've sort of improved the system to make sure there isn't a shortfall, and that the pricing and the money that local authorities are going to get is more accurate. So yeah, and there's more information. I won't bore you to death, but around, how the invoices are issued. So you can either pay all of it up front, or you can pay it quarterly, depending upon the size of your bill. But there are penalties if you don't pay your EPR bill through PAC UK on time. So that's just a little bit about how the invoices work and who issues the invoices. Okay, I know we've got 7 minutes left, so we're nearly to the end, and I do want to make sure that we've got time for questions. I won't go through this. This is just a timeline to highlight when the reporting periods are, when to expect invoices. So hopefully you find this helpful, so you can sort of see now over the next couple of years when the government is expecting to send invoices out, and how RAM will impact that, and when the reporting periods fall. So just a little bit about some of the challenges that we've been hearing that is impacting the industry specifically. So there's been a few articles actually in the news that I've sort of dropped here, how sort of the brewing industry and drinks manufacturers have been impacted by EPR. So at the moment, there's sort of big producers that have actually, massive bills have landed because of EPR, purely because, glass is heavy, so it means a big tonnage, and, glass is £190 per tonne, so that your compliance bill can go up quite quickly. So some of the main challenges in the industry are that, typically your industry is facing higher fees purely because the material you handle is heavier compared to, cardboard or plastic packaging, which means that, it's heavier weight, which means your tonnage is higher, and potentially, I think it was estimated that EPR has added around £124 million specifically to your sector, which has meant, approximately 4 to 5p having, increase on per bottle, if businesses needed to account for this cost. But I guess the issue with EPR is, the bills are landing after the packaging's been put onto the market. So for the first year, actually, businesses have already sold that packaging, and then an EPR bill has landed. So then to get that cost back, has been quite difficult. So really with EPR, it's really thinking, 1 or 2 years ahead. How are the costs going to impact me in 2027 or 2026? So as a business, you can start to think about how you integrate some of these costs, you know, into the supply chain, rather than, having to deal with this cost after the packaging's been sold. So those are sort of some of the things that businesses are starting to think about now. And it is a big impact, especially on sort of smaller brewers, that can be disproportionately affected, especially, if you're in the craft or trade, or you're an independent brewer. This cost can impact you quite a lot. So it's really sort of thinking about, what's the packaging I handle and what is going to be the cost impact. And what we also have seen is obviously the supply chain effect. So these costs are obviously being passed down by suppliers onto pubs and retailers. However, retailers have got their own compliance bill and waste management costs to deal with. So there seems to also be that push from retailers and pubs trying to push some of their costs back up the supply chain. So there seems to be this push and pull at the moment in the industry of who do we need to, attribute this cost to. So it is about working together and understanding, because, if you're a supplier, the likelihood is your customers are going to try and push some of this cost back onto you. But vice versa, you as a manufacturer are going to have a compliance bill, so you might want to then push some of this cost back down the supply chain. So there is that going on in the industry. And like all businesses, EPR is a massive admin burden. If you're a large company with multiple sites, multiple entities, gathering this information, pulling it all together, understanding your obligations, is a massive task. So there is a massive admin burden that impacts businesses under EPR. And I know there's a lot of conversation around policy at the moment, specifically around glass, and how, possibly how the industry is unfairly impacted, and whether EPR fees should be based on weight and tonnage. So I know there's a lot going on there. So if you're interested in more information on that, we can share. And it's always best to, if you're part of a trade association, to talk to your trade association about these things, because they will be lobbying on your behalf, to support with how, they can push how the industry is being impacted, and if policy is going to be changed, how that can be taken into account, from your point of view. So those are some of the impacts, and really from our point of view, and how we're supporting customers and what we've seen. Our advice really would be, really check the accuracy of your data. The bills under EPR are significant, and they are related to the data that you're declaring. So it's really important for you to understand your obligations and make sure that the data you're declaring is accurate, because if there's any discrepancies in the data, it can have a large impact on your bill. So that's a great place to start, to understand, are my weights accurate? Am I including the right obligations? Is there any gaps in my data? So, have I got a lot of packaging in red that I can think about moving? How do I move that to green going forwards? Because that will reduce my bill. So modeling sort of your cost exposure and looking at, okay, I know that fee modulation is coming in, the fees are only going to go up. What is my cost exposure over the next 2 years if I don't do anything? So it's definitely worth looking at the fees that have been issued by the government and working out what your bill could look like under the next couple of years. And then really focusing on, the lines that impact your cost the most. Which SKUs hold the biggest, fee impact? Is there anything you can do about those? and then, involve EPIs. It can be passed around businesses like a hot potato, and nobody wants to deal with it, or it can be handled by anyone from the admin department all the way up to the MD, the finance director. So a broad spectrum of people in businesses can be responsible for EPR, but it is becoming sort of a collaborative journey. So I think if you can get people involved from procurement, finance, supply chain, they will hold different insights, and they might hold the data. So coming together will help you put an accurate submission together. And there's just an example there of how we've worked with the business by, we worked with a current client recently to really understand their bill and their data, and was able to help them reduce their bill quite significantly. So there's definitely things you can do. And I'm going really fast now because I know I'm overrunning. So that's sort of just some practical steps of what it might be worth looking at if you are faced with quite a big bill. And then I'm not going to cover this because you'll get the slides afterwards, but it's just a bit more about Ecovertias. So please take your time just to see how we support businesses. And that sort of brings us to an end. So I know we've overran, but we can stay on if people are willing to for the next 5 minutes or so to cover any questions if anyone's got any. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.
EPR it's very, very new to me, especially being very, very new to the industry. I see that you mentioned something about like pallets, for example. You only have to claim or report those in their first use. Does that apply to things like cask and keg, which obviously a lot of brewers put their product into, but those cask and keg circulate around the industry? So what happens with those if they're sending on to a pub or a tap room, etc., and then that keg and cask is being circulated back into the industry and being filled with different product?
Yeah, it's exactly the same principle. So usually it's referred to as you declare that packaging on its maiden voyage. So you declare it when it's new. So when that keg is new and you fill it for the first time, depending upon who owns that keg. So, if it's the brand owner or it's an unbranded keg that's being filled into, you declare it the first time. So it will go on your EPR submission when it's new. Then once it comes back and it's then reused, it becomes secondhand. So it's not obligated and you don't declare it on the form again. So you sort of pay for it once on its maiden voyage. So exactly the same as pallets or any other, businesses use. A lot of supermarkets use crates, or automotive industry uses a lot of crates and things like that for parts. So yeah, that's how you would use that, use the guidance and just use it once it's new for the first time.
Okay, so a lot of the brewers, obviously they don't own their own kegs, so they are produced by a keg manufacturer and they are rented most of the time, and then they are circulated into the industry. So I'd assume then that it's the keg manufacturers that would pay those types of fees if that keg is then new and they're hiring that out or renting that keg out. And then it's basically when it hits the brewer, they have no obligation for those cask and keg, which obviously are very heavy because most of them are made out of steel. And so the tonnage would be, quite a hefty fee. So that bill is landing with the manufacturers of the kegs, not the actual fillers of those kegs, usually.
Right, yeah. So if you're leasing packaging, it will be the lessor that picks up the responsibility. So yeah, they'll handle that and put it on their form. So the brewers, they just class it as leased packaging, and they won't declare it on the form. Again, similar to like check pallets that are in a lease system.
Sure.
So yeah, it will be the person who leases those out that will pick up the responsibility. Again, I don't know if it happens, but unless your brand is on that keg, so then that's something to think about, and then muddies the waters a bit. But yeah, but that's the guidance under EPR at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. Has anybody else got any more questions that they'd like Sandy or Lily to answer for them?
It's too early for questions.
Too early for questions. But we will be distributing the slides, and obviously the recording is going to be published as well in a few days. But I can also share Sandy and Lily's contact information with everyone that has joined us today and that has registered. So if you do want to get in touch with them directly with any specific questions, you can do so. So if there's no more questions, I just want to thank Sandy and Lily for your time and delivering, like you say, a very, very informative webinar for us today. I think it's a very complicated issue, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate how complex it is. And it's a new system where obligations can be quite confusing. So if anyone does need any support, you can reach out to Sandy and Lily at a future date. But thank you very much for your time and the information that you've delivered today. It's been really, really useful.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. And yeah, please do give us feedback through the form that you're going to send, because it's always great to know, like, if we were to run another webinar, how could we change it, or what would you like to hear? What would be the next step in terms of, if we were to run another webinar on EPR, what would everyone find useful? Because I appreciate, when you're doing an overview for the first time, it's quite hard to bespoke it, because you need to sort of cover what's the thresholds, how you're obligated.
Mm-hmm.
But we can absolutely run a separate session that's more bespoke to, certain companies. We could do one specifically for brewers, or we could do one specifically, for bottlers, or whatever it might be. It'd be great to just get your feedback on what you found useful, what wasn't so useful. Did we use too many acronyms, which we always do? And so yeah, it'd just be great to have any feedback. But yeah,
Yes.
Thank you very much for having us, and it's lovely that people took the time out to join, especially so early in the morning, and listen. And hopefully we didn't bore you to death.
No, you absolutely didn't. Like you say, it's a complex issue that needs the time dedicated to it, and a lot of people need help navigating this, or at least certain pieces of information that they might not have realised. Deadlines, fees, obligations, their turnover, where they sit. So I think it was really, really valuable. So thank you. So yeah, I will send out a feedback form. I will also copy in Sandy and Lily to that email. So if you want to contact them directly, this will go out. We're Thursday now, so it'll probably go out early next week when the recording has been edited. But yeah, if you've got any questions in the meantime, you can always email me and I can put you in touch. But yeah, thank you very much for joining, and please fill in that feedback when you receive it. It'll be very, very helpful. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.